Now, regarding some actions contrary to marital fidelity, let's begin with adultery. If this commandment prohibits nothing else, it always prohibits adultery. Adultery, by definition, is marital infidelity. More specifically, sexual relations between two people, at least one of whom is married to someone else. According to Catholic teaching, adultery is also a violation of the cardinal virtue of justice, in that it disrespects the rights of one's spouse, and it compromises the welfare of children who need their parents' stable union. Of course, in the Church's understanding, it also involves freely chosen sexual activity that is neither fully unitive nor fully procreative. Next, let's turn to the question of divorce. So divorce wrongly claims to break the contract to which the spouses freely consented to live with each other until death. In other words, the Church holds that it is generally contrary to marital fidelity. Moreover, the Catechism says that divorce can harm children and have a contagious and negative effect on society as a whole. However, those who are divorced are not always guilty of wrongdoing. To begin with, Catholic teaching recognizes that it can be permissible to separate. This can be appropriate in cases of physical or mental abuse, certainly. Moreover, the Church maintains that if civil divorce remains the only possible way of ensuring certain legal rights, the care of the children, or the protection of inheritance, it can be tolerated. When it comes to divorce in general, the spouse who has tried to maintain marital fidelity and did not initiate a divorce has not contravened the moral law. What about remarriage while one's spouse is still alive? Well, whether or not divorce was permissible, remarriage while one's spouse is still alive is always morally impermissible. Since the bond of marriage only dissolves at the death of one of the spouses, to remarry is to commit adultery, in the Church's understanding, and therefore is contrary to marital fidelity. Another issue is polygamy. What's polygamy? Here you're actually claiming to be married to more than one person. But marrying more than one spouse is also always morally impermissible. According to the Catechism, it is contrary to the equal personal dignity of men and women who in matrimony give themselves with a love that is total and therefore unique and exclusive. So, we could say polygamy is also contrary to marital fidelity, in that it is not possible to be fully faithful when married to more than one person. What is contraception? It can be defined as every action, whether in anticipation of a freely chosen sexual act or in its accomplishment, proposes, whether as an end or as a means, to render procreation impossible. For example, the condom, the birth control pill, or the diaphragm. Sterilization is simply a permanent form of contraception. For instance, vasectomy, the removal of part or all of the vas deferens of the man, or tubal ligation, the sealing of the fallopian tubes of the woman. Both contraception and sterilization are prohibited by Catholic teaching. Why? Well, Catholic teaching suggests that in the case of contraception and sterilization, you have freely chosen sexual activity that is not fully procreative, by definition, but actually is not fully unitive or self-giving either, since the couple withholds their fertility from each other. Along these lines, John Paul II states that the innate language that expresses the total reciprocal self-giving of husband and wife is overlaid, through contraception, by an objectively contradictory language, namely that of not giving oneself totally to the other. This leads not only to a positive refusal to be open to life, but also to a falsification of the inner truth of conjugal love, which is called upon to give itself in personal totality. In my estimation, such a statement hints that contraception is not just a violation of the 6th commandment, but also the 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness, which calls us to be truthful. Later on, we'll look at some further rationales that have been put forth in favor of the Church's position. Next, we turn to natural family planning. So, does the Church teach that spouses must have as many children as humanly possible? No, of course not. And that brings us to the topic of natural family planning. Natural family planning, or NFP for short, is a natural means of birth regulation which allows couples to have a more precise knowledge of the time of ovulation in order to avoid, or as we'll see later, achieve pregnancy. There are various different methods of NFP. One is the same for all women, or most women, the calendar or standard days method, in which the woman is presumed to be infertile from days 8 through 19 of her menstrual cycle, as long as her cycle is usually between 26 and 32 days in length. So the idea is, if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, you abstain from sex on those days. But if you're trying to achieve pregnancy, you do try to have sex on those days, 8 through 19. Now, more research needs to be done on the effectiveness of this particular method, although, according to one study, it has a perfect use efficacy in avoiding pregnancy of 95%, meaning only 5 out of 100 women who use it perfectly to avoid pregnancy would get pregnant each year. Other types of NFP are specific to the individual woman, meaning they measure body temperature, the consistency of cervical fluid, or both, and the perfect use efficacy in avoiding pregnancy of some of these more sophisticated methods is up to 99%. As you can see, thanks to modern science, natural family planning is very reliable today in avoiding pregnancy, much more so than it used to be. An older version of natural family planning, the rhythm method, gave rise to the old joke. What do you call a couple who uses natural family planning? Parents. Fortunately, that joke no longer makes as much sense as it used to. In any case, using NFP to avoid pregnancy is permitted, according to Catholic teaching, under the condition that the couple has just or serious reasons to postpone pregnancy. What might be some serious reasons for a married couple to postpone pregnancy? Well, this could include physical or psychological reasons. For instance, pregnancy would pose a serious danger to the physical health of the mother or the psychological well-being of the couple. Or it could be economic reasons. In other words, the couple just cannot afford to have another child at the present time. What would not be considered a serious reason to postpone pregnancy? Well, let's say the couple already takes a couple of vacations to Fiji per year and would like to have the money for a few more vacations there. That, of course, would not be considered a serious reason. It's important to note that the Catholic Church does not have a list of serious reasons to avoid pregnancy. What it says is this: the couple's duty is to ensure that their desire to postpone pregnancy is not motivated by selfishness, but is in conformity with the generosity appropriate to responsible parenthood. So, how exactly does a couple decide what amounts to a serious reason and what doesn't? By using the cardinal virtue of prudence, which, as you may recall from earlier, helps us decide what the right thing to do is, and then to actually carry that out. According to Catholic moral theology, in order to exercise this virtue, couples need to form their conscience. In other words, make sure their conscience is correct. And they can do this through reflecting on their own past life experiences with raising children, consulting the advice of others, such as a spiritual counselor or priest, and trying to directly discern God's will through prayer or reading the Bible. Why is using NFP permitted while contraception is prohibited, when the intention is the same in both cases, to avoid pregnancy? Well, the Church teaches that in the case of contraception, a couple is directly trying to render a fertile act infertile. In other words, the object is bad, and therefore the entire act is bad. In the case of NFP, to avoid pregnancy for just reasons, however, the idea is that a couple is not trying to make a fertile act infertile. In other words, there would be no problem with the object, abstaining during the fertile times and having fully self-giving sex during the infertile times, and there would also be no problem with the intention, avoiding pregnancy for just reasons, and so the entire act is good. One final point. While using contraception is always bad, according to the Church, as always, it would add that circumstances can increase or diminish the evil of that act. So, if a couple is already familiar with Church teaching and uses contraception under no duress, that would increase the badness and their responsibility for the act. On the other hand, if for some reason the couple was never adequately informed about Church teaching on contraception and or used it out of weakness one time without much premeditation, that would decrease the badness and their responsibility, although the act is still considered evil in itself. Let's next turn to some medical procedures that unintentionally bring about infertility. Sometimes there are medical procedures which unintentionally bring about infertility. For example, a man who has testicular cancer may have both testicles removed, which has the good effect of curing the cancer, but the bad effect of causing infertility. Or a woman with endometriosis, a painful condition that occurs when uterine tissue grows in the abdomen. Or an ovarian cyst problem. She may take the birth control pill, which has the good effect of alleviating the symptoms somewhat, but the bad effect of making her infertile. Are these procedures morally permissible? Well, as we've seen in the case of actions with good and bad effects, the principle of double effect applies. Let's analyze the first medical procedure I just mentioned. Is the first step of the principle of double effect passed? Well, what's the object? Removing testicles. Is that bad in itself? Not necessarily. It's certainly not one of those objects that the church teaches is always wrong, like murder or rape. So yes, we've passed this first criterion. Do we pass the second step of the principle of double effect? Yes, assuming you only desire the good effect, curing cancer, and not the bad effect, causing infertility. All right, let's turn to the third step. Do we pass that? Sure. The bad effect, the infertility, does not cause the good effect, the curing of cancer. Rather, the object of the act, the medical procedure itself, is what causes the good effect. Finally, do we pass the fourth step of the principle? Yes. Curing cancer, and therefore being able to survive, outweighs the unfortunate loss of fertility. So, since we've passed all four steps of the principle of double effect, this procedure is morally permissible. One could also add the condition that in order for such a procedure to be permissible, there must be no simpler therapy available that would maintain fertility. So in other words, if you can find an action with little to no bad effect, you'd obviously prefer that one. In the case of endometriosis, for example, NaPro technology claims to treat the underlying condition better, and so it's arguably preferable to taking the birth control pill, which has been classified as a carcinogen by the World Health Organization. The use of condoms by married couples to prevent the transmission of HIV/AIDS. The Catholic Church, interestingly, has not officially pronounced on this issue yet, but let's analyze it anyway. Remember, according to Catholic action theory, all three elements, object, intention, and circumstances, must be good for the entire act to be good. Okay, what's the intention here? You're trying to prevent infection. That's good. Everybody agrees on that. How about the object, though? Some might say the object involves using a condom, or more specifically, using a condom in order to have sex, but not contraception. Is using a condom always bad? Not necessarily. As one moral theologian, Martin Ronheimer, argues, condoms cannot be intrinsically evil, only human acts. Condoms are not human acts, but things. And to take an obvious example, a condom makes an excellent water collection device in case of emergency. There's nothing wrong with that. Such an argument might add that the circumstances are fine. The couple isn't having sex in public, and engaging in sexual activity can strengthen their marital bond. Another way to put this argument is as follows. Since the object is not contraception, the couple's freely chosen sex can still be fully unitive and procreative. But others, such as moral theologian Nicanor Austriaco, suggest that the object in this instance is contraception, rendering a fertile act infertile. And as we've seen, this object is always bad from the perspective of Catholic teaching. Austriaco further indicates that the circumstances, and more specifically the consequences of the act, are not that good, for condom use is not 100% effective at preventing the spread of HIV/AIDS. He concludes that in light of this, the truly loving thing for the couple to do would be to abstain from sexual activity. Another way to put this argument is as follows. Since the object is contraception, then the couple is engaging in freely chosen sexual activity that is not fully procreative. So, because there is no Catholic teaching on this issue yet, and because of apparent disagreement among moral theologians as to the nature and moral value of the object and circumstances here, this issue is disputed. Catholics can come to an informed conclusion about it using the virtue of prudence, which we talked about above. The prevention of conception in victims of sexual assault. We were just dealing with cases where any contraceptive effect is either unintended, or at least arguably so. But what about the case of rape? Can a woman ask her assaulter to use a condom, or can she use spermicides or anti-ovulatory drugs after the fact in order to prevent conception? The answer is actually yes, according to many Catholic ethicists and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The idea is that the woman is not contracepting, according to the definition I provided earlier, since she hasn't engaged or planned to engage in a freely chosen sex act with her perpetrator. Or, to put it another way, she hasn't run afoul of the rule that freely chosen sex must be fully unitive and procreative, since we're not dealing with freely chosen sex in the first place. Allowing her to prevent conception enables her to protect herself against a further violation of her dignity. It's simply an act of self-defense. However, keep in mind that such prevention is permitted only if the woman has been tested for pregnancy, and there is no evidence that conception has already occurred. And with certain forms of such prevention, such as the drug Plan B, there is debate over whether it poses an unacceptable risk to the life of an embryo, and therefore whether one may licitly use it. If conception has occurred in case of rape, or if there's an unacceptable risk of it, the consensus of the Catholic moral tradition has been that the woman may not abort even in this instance, because this would be a violation of the dignity of the newly created person. In other words, some have argued that here you have a sort of double violence, one that might, in turn, cause further distress, at least in certain cases. More specifically, in one study of women who had been made pregnant through rape, some of those who carried the pregnancy to term expressed the belief that they would have suffered even more by ending their child's life. While this view on abortion in cases of rape strikes many as harsh, it's important to note that in Evangelium Vitae, that's Latin for the Gospel of Life, Pope John Paul II bent over backwards to reach out and offer some caring words to women dealing with pregnancies in difficult situations. Here are some words from near the end of that encyclical letter. I would now like to say a special word to women who have had an abortion. The Church is aware of the many factors which may have influenced your decision, and she does not doubt that in many cases it was a painful and even shattering decision. The wound in your heart may not yet have healed. Certainly what happened was and remains terribly wrong. But do not give in to discouragement, and do not lose hope. Try rather to understand what happened and face it honestly. If you have not already done so, give yourselves over with humility and trust to repentance. The Father of mercies is ready to give you his forgiveness and his peace in the sacrament of reconciliation. To the same Father and his mercy, you can, with sure hope, entrust your child. Pope Francis has expressed very similar sentiments as Pope as well. Keep in mind, too, that while the Catholic moral tradition does prohibit direct abortions, which aim at the death of an unborn child, it does permit indirect abortions, which involve the foreseen but unintended loss of a baby as a result of a medical procedure necessary for the preservation of the life of his mother. An example would be a salpingectomy to treat an ectopic pregnancy, where the embryo grows in the fallopian tube rather than the uterus.